Welcome back to Church of the Rock's Expedited Audio Training. I just so enjoyed you guys hanging out with us and doing this training. In session 5, we learned how to prepare for mixing, and now in session 6, we want to put it all together and start mixing. I really think if a person learns the concepts we talked about, does all the preparation that we talked about diligently, by the time you actually get to mixing, it almost feels easy. Just make it sound good. Or to put it another way, if a system is working, sound check was done well, you understand your mixing board, then you can just start concentrating on making intuitive choices to make the mix sound good. You don't have to focus on all those little details. But if there's been major audio problems, sound check kind of went poorly, a rehearsal was cut short, you're worrying about things maybe stopping working in the service, it's actually very hard to achieve a good mix. So in session 6, we talk about the major concepts to help you learn how to achieve quality mixes consistently. I hope you enjoy the video and complete all the questions, and let's dive in. So today we're learning about mixing. So before you ever really want to start mixing, it's really helpful to know why you want to get a good mix. It's really important to have a purpose for your good mix. As if we do anything, we want to know why we're doing it, and that'll help us. So I've found there's at least 5 good reasons to get a good mix. The first one is we want to honor and glorify God. With everything we do here at Church of the Rock and anything you should be wanting to do in life, we want to do it with excellence so that it glorifies our God in heaven and that we can do something really well so that He is pleased with it. The second reason for mixing well, especially in a church environment, is to help the congregation in worship. If the band is sounding how it should, if there's no distracting feedback or sounds that are too quiet or too loud, if the mix is sitting how it should, that's going to help people to be able to just participate, to just sing, to just worship God, and that'll be very helpful. The third thing I've found is that a good quality and an excellent mix is actually a bit of a witness to the world. The world has gotten used to a certain level of quality when they go to a concert, and if they come into a church and the level of quality is significantly lower, I think that sets a bit of a bad example. If a simple rock band can get a fairly good mix, hopefully a worship band can get an even better one. So there's a really good reason to want to do well, is that we want to be a good witness to the world as well. If a new person comes into this building for the first time, they should be impressed by the worship instead of turned off by it. The fourth reason, I think, is there's a good chance to honor the work the band has done. So if the band has really put a lot of work into their practicing their instrument, to learning what they're doing, if you mix it really well, that's going to help them feel good about the work they put in, and it's a way to honor the work they've done. And the fifth reason is just personal satisfaction. I know that when I've dialed in a perfect mix or something just sounds really good, that just is a good feeling to me. It almost feels like I'm sort of part of the band, I was part of making this great sound. And so that's another really good purpose to do mixing. So there's probably way more reasons than that, but I think those are 5 really good reasons to want to achieve the best mix you could possibly have. The second thing I want to talk about today is the how to approach a good mix. So you can't just start moving things randomly hoping for a good mix. That never works. You have to have a logical, systematic approach to how you do that. And the first thing you need to do is, again, realize what kind of mix you are going for. So we've talked about this in previous sessions, but there is many different types or styles of mixing. Some could be very vocal heavy with the band sitting far behind. Some are more empty and spacious sounding. Some are very full. And so you have to know what the band you're mixing is trying to achieve and what you're trying to get out of it. It was also stated previously that at Church of the Rock, what we're going for is usually something to do with fullness and bigness. If you think of Hillsong, where they quite often have a stage full of instrumentalists and everything is really large sounding and full, that is usually what we're going after. So it's really good to know that's what you're going after, and that way you can get a sense of what you're aiming for. In addition, at Church of the Rock, usually a lead vocal only sits just a little above the rest of the instruments, with the background vocals are about at the same level as the other kind of rhythm instruments, and instead of it being way above. It's also good to note that in lots of different times in a worship set, there might be 4 or 5 songs, and even the songs within the songs, you might have different mixing styles between them. We might be doing a song that was more synth heavy or more like electronic music sounding, and you're going to have probably quite a different instrument mix than you're going to have in the other songs that are much more like rock band kind of sounding. So even within your worship sets, you might have to have different mixing styles. So it's really good to be aware of what you have and what you're going for and what the worship leader is after, so you can give them what they want. So a really critical thing to be doing well and to be considering when you're mixing is your mixing level. If you're mixing for a congregation, you're mixing for at front of house for a group of people in a room, the amount of sound in the room is very important. If it's too quiet, people won't engage at all, but if it's too loud, it'll be hurting people's hearing, and we don't want to be doing that. And more critically than that, the right level is also going to be helping people with how they worship and how they participate. What we actually are going after at Church of the Rock is we want to have a level where it's loud enough so that when people sing, they don't feel self-conscious that people are hearing them sing. It's loud enough where they feel like they can get lost in the mix a little bit, but quiet enough so it doesn't feel like they're at a concert and they disengage. And there actually has been enough people doing this over enough trial and error, and even from our own experience, that there's kind of a range of decibels where this works, and that's roughly 85 to 95 decibel. At that range, you really have this where it's loud enough that you engage, but it's not so loud that you feel like you're at a concert. And it really makes quite a big difference. For spoken word, the level is noticeably lower. We have found in our room that to have a loud enough that a person can be heard well without people having to strain their hearing, but not so loud that it feels harsh, is somewhere 76 or 78 decibel. And so when there's someone just preaching on the stage by themselves or just doing announcements, that's the level we're going to be hitting there. There is a situation where the band will still be playing quietly, and then the worship leader might start praying or talking. In that case, you're never going to bring the whole mix down to 76 or 78. That's just going to become far too quiet. It's going to take people out of worship. But you're going to have to use your common sense there to have a level that will sound roughly the same as when the pastor is preaching, or sound roughly the same as someone doing announcements while the band is still playing. So that might be somewhere around 85 decibels. It's hard to say for sure, but just have to use your common sense, use your judgment, use your ear. And in those kind of situations, you want to make sure that that worship leader is heard, people can hear them talking or praying, but that the band doesn't completely drop away unnecessarily. So that's a situation that comes up fairly often, so it's good to be aware of that as well. The decibel meter really helps because sometimes people around you, their perception will get a bit off, and they'll think you're mixing louder or quieter than you should. And even for yourself, sometimes you might have an off day. So the decibel meter is not supposed to be something that you go by absolutely all the time, 100%, but it can be a really good guide to help you know if you're in the right range, in the right level. But for the most part, though, if a building or a campus has set a certain decibel level peak, we want to do our absolute best not to go over that, or even just very briefly and bring it right back down. So that's something really good to keep in mind. So for someone who's learning to do sound, especially in a house of worship or a church like ours, there's really a certain set of skills that will really help you become the best you can be. If you don't work on these skills, you'll become a better and better sound person, and it's going to just help your mixes become better and better over time. It's really important to have really good skills. The first one is you need to have a good ear. And this is kind of an expression used to say someone who can start to listen with detail, someone who can start learning how to discern smaller differences than the average person might in either how something sounds, the level of things, someone who'll be able to pick out an instrument more quickly if someone's singing maybe a bit off or a bit too loudly. So a good ear is something about learning how to make things sound well, just by listening to it. And this is something some people are born with a bit more naturally. They just naturally have a better sense of music, a better sense of sound. But this is definitely something you can learn and develop, even by simply listening to music critically, as we talked about last time. By listening to mixes, listening to what sounds good, why it does, why it doesn't. Any practice you can have mixing, any cueing, you'll start to notice differences more soon. And so having a good ear is an incredibly important skill to have, and something you can develop over time. The next one is musicality. So you don't need to be a musician to be a good sound person. They do say, however, mediocre musicians make the best sound guys. The reason is that they're not good enough to be on the stage, but they have enough experience to know what a band member might want, and they also enjoy music. So even if you have no instrument background at all, no music experience at all, just even if you're a person who appreciates music and starts to learn to listen to different styles of music, listens to music more often, that's going to be something that's going to help you, because you're going to appreciate what needs to go in to a mix. You're going to kind of get a sense of what the band members are working on, what they're trying to accomplish. And so the more musical of a person you can be overall, the better you'll do at mixing. Another really critical skill is alertness. So when you're mixing, there is literally probably hundreds of little things that are going on, and there's quite often last-minute changes. A pastor might run up onto the stage. You might have someone come up to you with something. Another instrument might, break a string, so you have to watch that. Someone might do something quite a bit different with one of the sounds they're using. And so there's many things you need to watch out for. So being someone who's alert and not just getting distracted, not having a mind wandering, not being on your phone. Some of these things is by being present in the moment. This is going to really help you to mix well because you're not going to miss little things. This is going to help you to support the band. Let's say a battery dies in a mic, you can catch it before it happens. So alertness is a really important skill to develop. The next one is smoothness. Now, this is something where you're not being a smooth talker or a smooth character, that might help as well. But this is something about where the way you work, you'll do it in such a way that changes will be less noticeable. There'll be a way you do things where it's not going to come across clunky or clumsy or harsh. And you're going to work in such a way that's going to come across smooth. That could be something as simple as when you're changing from different parts of the songs, your fader movements aren't jarring. They're a bit more slow, but they're also, you think of things before they happen so you can catch them as they happen. This is partly why you need to take notes, to pay attention to the rehearsal. All these things are going to help you to be able to catch things before they happen so you can get there before they do. You can instead of reacting to things, you're proactively doing things. Some specific things that'll be important to do for smoothness is, for example, if you need to, let's say, mute an instrument during the service for whatever reason, let's say a string breaks or something, if you mute them suddenly because they stopped playing, that's fine because they're not playing. But when they come back in, instead of just turning them right back on, it could have a jarring suddenly coming back on. You would pull their fader all the way down, then turn their channel on, and then slowly push their fader back in. Those small things can make a huge difference because you won't have all these jarring things coming up and going down. And one critical thing that can be a common kind of mistake for someone who's just starting is, let's say you're setting the head amp gain of a microphone and some other factor is happening so that you're not actually getting sound from it. Either the channel's not turned on or it's going through a DCA that's turned down, and there could be a few other things why you're not getting sound. So a person who's just starting might just keep turning the gain up, not getting any sound. Then they'll find the problem and they'll just turn the channel on. All of a sudden you'll get a massive wave of sound, potentially distortion and feedback. And this is something we really want to avoid at all costs. This can hurt people's hearing, it can wreck sound systems, it can just be a real jarring thing. So if you ever have a case where you're turning gain up and you're not getting any sound after quite a while, before you do anything else, turn that gain back down. Then go looking for the problem. Then once you find it, again, maybe pull that fader all the way down, then turn the channel on, push it up slowly, figure out your gain level. But whatever you do, don't just suddenly turn that channel on with that gain cranked, otherwise you're going to have all kinds of problems. So this is going to be a few little things, a few examples of smoothness. As you start developing these skills, you're going to be much more smooth, and that's going to help you do really well. Related to that is attention to detail. Not quite the same as being smooth, but attention to detail is there's lots of things to watch. Like I said, there could be batteries that are dropping. There could be notes to take for the service. There could be recordings you have to make sure you start. So what's really important is you start just to pay attention. You really are there again, you're present, and you make note of things that need to change. And just watch the small details. Even how cables are wrapped, all these small things will make you a better sound person. And again, related to that is professionalism. So the better you lay out your stage, the more you show up on time when you're called to a service, the way you treat the band, the way you use politeness, all that professionalism, you might think that's a good trait to have, but not necessarily help your mixing, but it will actually help your mixing because the band will feel more comfortable with you, you'll feel more comfortable with the band, and they'll play a bit better. You'll probably mix better because the relationships are better. So being professional is actually a huge skill to have as an audio technician. And the actual last one, which might surprise you, is technical knowledge. I specifically put that last because of all these skills, it's actually probably, in some ways, the least important. At the very least, it's the easiest to learn. Technical skills, you can watch a course like this, you can read a manual, you can learn a mixing board, and that's all good and fine. But if you don't have a thing like an ear, you don't have a sense of music at all, if you don't have a sense of how things are supposed to sound, it doesn't really matter how well you know your mixing board, you're still not going to get a good mix. So technical skills if you have them really down pat, then they'll allow you to use all these equipment as a tool to create something beautiful with it and to create a great mix. So it is still an important skill. I don't want to downplay it too much. It's really important to learn the technical side. But if you have to focus on what to learn, focus even more so on your ear, your musicality, your professionalism, your alertness, and then work on your technical skills. And having them all working together will be the absolute best combination. And they'll all grow in time as long as you put the work into them. So as you are learning and as you're shadowing people, as you're mixing, really be thinking about how you can learn and develop these skills. And the last thing I want to talk about before we actually get into mixing is live broadcast mix. What that means is in Church of the Rock, we have a front of house mixing console, and this is to mix for the congregation in our sanctuary. And all of our campuses or satellite campuses will have a very similar but smaller mixing board for their congregations. But at the South Campus, we have what's called a broadcast mix position. And this is now any audio that's going to go basically out of our building. So this is for our on-demand video or audio podcasts, even for the TVs on the screens outside of our room, our archive. There's actually a number of places where audio goes outside of this room. And that whole mix is done by another person. The reason why it has to be done by another person is that this mix in here is for this room, and it actually will sound quite different than what you will need to send out to the world, because there is sound we're hearing from the stage. Our PA system will be set up differently. So my mix that I'm doing here will sound good in this room, but it won't sound good on a recording, for example. So we need to do a whole separate mix where they all have the same thing, where they have their own mixing board, they have all their own individual channels, and they'll create a whole separate mix of the same exact worship set. And that's what's going to go out to our online church and all those things I mentioned. So I just wanted to mention a few differences that are in that broadcast mix position. And even if you never mix that position, it's good to be aware of it, because then you'll get a better understanding of what's going out to the world and how it differs from what you do. The first thing is panning. Now, most of our rooms at Church of the Rock are actually mono, which means that the sound coming out of every single speaker is exactly the same. The reason for that is if you had a hard panning, if something was left and right, something that was panned hard left would be able to be heard by the people on the left, but not at all by the people on the right, and vice versa. So having a mono room helps us to get everybody gets the exact same instrument mix, and that works out really well. But for any kind of broadcast, for any kind of people listening on any kind of headphones, that's not going to sound as good as it could. We're used to hearing any kind of recorded or pre-recorded music done in stereo, and it just sounds a bit better in those contexts. So when you're upstairs mixing, now you have to consider how far left, how far right things are. And for the most part, it matches roughly how the band is laid out on the stage, but there's definitely some room for creativity, or even just to make sure your mix is balanced left to right, where you might have something on the left even though they're standing on the right. For the most part, people might not even be fully aware of that, but it'll definitely sound good, and definitely another skill to learn that you're not going to need too often at front of house. Levels. So I talked about how level in this room is all about the amount of sound that's coming out through the speakers, the overall level of sound in the room. For broadcast mix, it's actually exactly kind of the opposite. What they are mixing for is they're mixing for output level on the meters of their soundboard, because they need to make sure they're not clipping to any of these output sources that they're getting recorded down to. So there's specific levels that you would learn if you started that in that position. And then the sound in that room is only important for making sure that the person can hear it accurately. The actual amount of how quiet or how loud it is won't affect the sound going out at all on its own, just how the sound person needs to hear it. One thing that the broadcast mix has that we don't have at front of house is audience mics. Because we hear the audience because we're part of it, we don't need to have those mics in the room, plus that would cause just a feedback catastrophe. So in the broadcast mix, they have 7 separate audience mics, and they blend those in to the rest of the recording so that everybody who's outside of the room can hear the audience participation as well. So this is going to record them clapping and singing along. It's going to hear laughing to jokes, repeating the prayer back at the end. And so it's important to mix these well, and these are going to totally aid in a broadcast mix. And the last thing they have is starting audio recorders. Down here, quite often you're not usually needing to start a recorder. Sometimes you do, but they're for sure really important that they start these audio recorders, and something that they might have to be aware of and stay alert on in their case. One major difference, though, with the broadcast mix is they have almost no band interaction. while the front of house person is dialing in the monitors for the band, talking to them, even probably going backstage and hanging out with the band here and there. The broadcast mix person is in a separate room. They don't have to worry about monitors, and so they're going to not connect with the band much at all. So in some cases, it's good for that person to be intentional about going to meet the band, getting to know them, hanging out with them a bit, because the more you know the band, the more that they know what you're doing, the better off you are, again, with your mix. It's going to do a good job for everybody. So that's a whole different mix position. If you find yourself doing our broadcast mix, you get a little bit of a separate extra training because of some of those differences. And it's a fun position for some. It's fast and it's enjoyable, but it's quite a bit different than mixing for a congregation. So if that's something that interests you, that's something that we can teach you. Okay, so that's enough talking about mixing. Those are all good things, but let's actually start doing it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build for you a rough mix based on a recording that was done here in the church actually in March. We have a system where we can do a virtual sound check where we record every individual channel individually, and then we can play it back through our mixing board. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a mix using just levels. What we're doing is we're assuming that the sound check has been done, we've gotten our head amp gains correct, we've dialed in a rough EQ and compression, and now we're just using levels to dial in a mix. Because one thing that's really important to note is that how you set your levels is probably the main critical part of mixing. Getting compression exactly right is good, and getting EQ exactly right is awesome, but if those things even are a little off, but your levels are good, you'll still get a pretty good mix. But the contrary is not true. If your levels are quite a bit off, but your compression and EQ are perfect, it's still not going to be a great mix. Your levels is going to be one of the most critical things to get right. And a couple things to note about getting your levels right is that it's almost never static. When you're mixing a band, there's so many different changes in the songs. There's verses, choruses, pre-choruses, bridges. And as these songs change, quite often the instrumentation changes, the singers change. So I find myself, I've only maybe 30 seconds at the longest where I'm not changing something. Basically, you're constantly moving something, even if it's just a minute amount, and you're mixing kind of with the band. Some people will even refer to their audio tech as a mix musician because of this, that they're playing so much with the song that they're almost like a part of the band. That might be a bit of an extreme, but I definitely think it gets the point across that you're always doing something. Another thing to note while I'm mixing, I'm going to show a few things, is that we talked about level, is that you don't want to always be always pushing your levels up, because I want to hear a bit more guitar, so I throw more guitar in, but now I can't hear the piano, so I put more piano in. Okay, now I can't hear the vocals, so I put more vocals in. And you start just creeping up and up and up and up, and that's called fader creep. And then eventually your mix is super loud and nothing sounds clear. What's a much better practice to get into is if you can't hear something, think to yourself first, can anything else be pulled down? That's going to make that thing come out. So quite often if you can't hear vocals, if the guitars or sometimes bass or piano are too loud, you pull those down, sometimes even just a minute amount, you'll find the vocals suddenly come through better. So a much better practice is to think, what can I pull down instead of what has to be pushed up? So with all that said, I'm going to build a mix. From the left to the right, we're going to go from drums to bass to the instruments to vocals. And in a normal situation, this is not how you would mix. Normally you would do a sound check, and as you sound check, you would leave your faders up. And while they're rehearsing, you would still, most of the part, never have just one channel at a time. This is just going to be for the sake of being able to hear it, to hear the different parts, what they're doing. And I'll do a few comments in between here and there what I'm doing. And hopefully this gives you a sense of how a mix could go. And this is going to be a rough mix. It might not be the perfect absolute mix, but it's going to show you how to develop a rough mix. So let's start doing that. And this song starts off actually with the synthesizer, but I'm going to go from left to the right. So first we have kick. That's a pretty full and hefty kick drum. I'm going to add in some snare. For this part of the song, there's no hi-hat or ride, so I'm just going to add some in. We'll go back to that later. Same thing with the toms, they come in more later. Our overheads are capturing the ambience of the drum kit and the cymbals. So there's the hi-hat. There's some toms. So that's not a bad sound for drums, pretty good blend. So I'm going to add in the bass guitar. There's some hi-hats again. That sounds pretty good to my ear. Keep going here, I'm going to add the synthesizer. stop it for 1 second. So this is an interesting song. It's called Alive. It's by Hillsong Young and Free. And it's a really kind of synth-heavy song. And this is a song where the rhythm is really important, but you'll find it's not a really big, heavy guitar song. There is guitar, but it's more of actually more of like as in fill and color, but it's actually not the main instrument. The main instrument is actually going to be the synthesizer. So this song you're going to definitely mix differently than you're going to mix a big rock song. And so the level of that synth and what it plays is quite critical. And it actually goes up and down itself from what came on the stage. The person played a bit differently, so it got quite a bit louder at spots and got quieter at spots. When it goes from the verse to the chorus, it gets noticeably louder. I think he actually goes up an octave. So as we're mixing, if you see me changing that synth quite a bit, it's because their level was changing and the parts of the songs changed quite a bit. So that's one thing you're probably going to have to focus on getting really right in this song. So every song you really want to know what's the main instrument and what's going to cause the most amount of difference. And this song is the synth. So let's go back to mixing, where we have the synth in, and as the parts of the songs change, you'll hear different parts. So I'm just going to start the playback again. So that piano has almost more of an organ kind of sound. I'll bring in the acoustic. Bring in the electric guitar. The electric guitar stopped playing, so I'll come back to that. I'll get into the vocals. This is our lead vocalist. And I'll throw in right now all the background vocals together. We'll get into that more in detail in a second.
You are my freedom. We lift you higher, your love, never ending.
I'll put in some reverbs.
You are alive in us.
All right, so I'm going to stop it there for a second. So that was a reasonably decent rough mix. That's basically the main part of that song. Those levels were fairly good. But even as I stopped it there, the song was changing, and those levels now wouldn't have sounded very good. So what I really want to get into next is how the parts of the songs change, how you're going to be mixing different levels as the song goes on, and then I might give you some separate detail about background vocals and a little bit about reverb as well. So for now, I'm going to go back to the beginning of the song. We're going to hear that beginning of the song, and I'm going to be pointing out changes as the song changes, and you'll see me making different changes to different sounds as the song goes along. So back to the top of the song. So again, it starts off with synth, but a little bit quieter, a bit of bass, a bit of drums. The worship leader talks a little bit. That's where electric guitar comes in. Again, it's not a big prominent instrument, but has some nice color. Then they begin singing. And here I would pull down some of these instruments a little bit. Pull the instruments in a little bit. And for that, I'm actually using the DCAs, which you remember are kind of like groups. So there's some nice little guitar things happening there. Now here's a pre-chorus, so they're going to change their singing a bit. More of the background vocals come in. And here's going to go to the chorus. This is really, you want to hear that synthesizer pretty clearly. Pretty important right here. And I take the vocals down because the vocals actually got quite a bit louder in their singing. But then even here right now, the synth gets louder on its own. So you actually need to pull it down a bit. And the guitar starts doing this really hilarious, awesome guitar lead, so you want to make sure you hear that, but not too big. Now they're going to go back into the verse. Now you got to pull a lot of that stuff back. And push the vocals back in. So in that case there, I would have actually put those vocals in a little sooner. Just dismiss it there a little bit. Notice how you don't hear the synthesizer near as much. You hear a bit more acoustic. Electric's doing just a little color again. here again, pre-chorus, the singing is going to be a little louder. Guitar starts doing some fun stuff. And remember now, next thing coming up is that big chorus with the big synthesizer, so you gotta be ready for that ahead of time. Right here. Pull the vocals down a little bit. All right, so I'm gonna stop it there again for a second. Hopefully that gave you a bit of a sense on this song, how it goes really. All the different parts are quite different. I wasn't even giving you every change I would make, just the main ones. So for example, you saw me changing the synthesizer, going quite a bit louder when that chorus started, but then pulling back a bit even during the chorus because they started playing it louder. The background vocals started singing quite a bit more during the choruses and the lead as well. So I pulled them both down as I went. There were some small changes to that electric guitar. Where he's doing like some little color notes, but then if he's playing full chords, it would sound a bit too much for this song, and it's not a guitar-driven song, more just for color and accent and fill. So you need to be aware of all those different things. If you saw me moving 2 faders for electric guitar, that's because we actually had 2 outputs on the same guitar player, which is something I would explain if you were mixing here. But if that confused you, there's not 2 separate electric guitars, there was just 1. So I think hopefully that was enough to see that the really important difference that levels make. I didn't change any EQ while we were doing that. I didn't change any compression. I just changed levels, and you notice how quite a bit difference there was in those different parts. And sometimes even a small fader move will cause quite a big difference to your overall mix. So that's something to really develop a lot of skill on, something to practice whenever you have a chance. Most people, of course, don't have mixing boards at home, so practicing at church, but if you have any kind of home recording stuff you can do, this will definitely be something you can develop as a skill. But now I wanted to focus on a few more specific areas. And it's something you normally couldn't do on a regular weekend because you won't be able to turn everything else off just to hear vocals. This is kind of something to do more in just a training scenario. But what I want to do now is just mix background vocals. Now keep in mind, vocals usually aren't heard just on their own, and they might not sound quite as good as they sound in a whole mix. So if you hear anything a little bit off, then that's all right. It'll be a really good chance to hear some differences in some background vocals. So let's just go through that right now. So I'm going to actually mute the instruments and the drums, and we're going to play back just all the vocals, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how you would mix vocals together. So I'm going to find the spot in the song where there's more singing, which is usually the choruses. Okay, so I'm going to play it back now, but with just the vocals.
'Cause you are my freedom. We lift you higher, lift you higher.
So that's not a bad mix.
Your love, never ending.
What I'm going to do now, I'm actually going to go back and listen to them one at a time.
You are alive in.
So basically I'm going to listen to now just the lead vocal on its own.
We lift you higher, lift you
That's how they
higher.
sound, just to get myself acquainted with how each one of them sounds. And I'm going to hear just vocal 2. That's Derek, sound a certain way. That's vocal 3.
Nothing can take your place.
And that's vocal 4.
All we need. Your love has sent.
Now let's listen back to the lead vocal again.
Whoa.
So this is one thing where it's nice that we can do this in a training scenario where we can listen to everything one at a time. If you're in a live situation in a rehearsal, this is where you can use your headphones. This is the main function of the cue button. So if you have a headphones on, you hit the cue button, you adjust that source. So if I'm just trying to get myself acquainted with what every vocalist is doing so I can mix them better, I'll cue them one at a time, get a sense of what everybody's singing, how low or how high, how they're blending together. Then if I want to mix that background vocal group, if you actually cue the background vocal group itself by pressing if you're on the DCAs here and you press the cue button, now you'll actually hear the whole background vocal blend. You'll hear whoever is into that DCA. And as you change the faders on the right for the vocalist, it'll actually change what you're hearing in your headphones. So again, it's not going to sound exactly as the same as it's going to sound in the room, but this is a way to at least get a sense of the relative level between those 3 vocalists, and then when you take the headphones off, it should sound already probably a bit better because now you're able to blend those 3 on their own. And so let's just do that now. Again, using just the faders in this training situation that we have, we're going to listen to just the background vocals, and we're going to get a good blend of those three. So I was going to play that back with just the three background vocals.
In us, nothing can take your place. You are all we need. Your love has set us free. Whoa, whoa.
So some of this is subjective, just about how something should sound, but some of this is you want to have a fairly even blend, so they more sound like one big group instead of three individuals. So then when you blend the lead vocal back in
the midst of the darkest night, let your love be the shining light.
Still sounds like a lead vocal and then a
chains that
background
were
vocal behind them. That's what
holding
you're going for here.
You sent your son down to...
And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is reverb. So this is something, again, where we're going to talk about this more in session 7 coming up. But we want to talk about reverb, and we want to talk about just how it sounds. Again, when you're in a sound check situation or a rehearsal, quite often you won't be able to hear just the reverb on its own. But this is another place where you could cue the reverb sends and hear just what that reverb is doing. So I want to listen now just the vocals, and I'm going to really overdo the reverb just to hear what that sounds like. So we're going to listen to that.
Never ending, oh, oh, oh. You are alive in us. Nothing can take your place. You are all we need.
So that's not a very long reverb. It's actually fairly short. It has a bit of a nice tail to it. And if I push it up like that, it actually sounds quite nice. It's not overly long. And because this is a faster song, that's why we have a bit of a shorter reverb, because if it was too long, then as they were singing the next notes, there would still be reverb and it would start to make it sound muddy. So this is really nice where we can hear this reverb on its own. And we will now want to blend that into the rest of our mix as well. So now just to finish up here, I'm just going to go back into this mix for a little bit, play back. Now listen for that background vocal mix, listen for that reverb, and listen for the blend of all the instruments as I mix here. So that may not have been a 100% perfect mix, but I think that was a fairly decent rough mix. As you're rehearsing, this is another good reason for you to practice what you're doing, practice all these different moves, and by the time usually you're through a rehearsal, you can get a pretty satisfying and pretty good mix. So I hope this was helpful for you in how you're going to set your levels, especially in your mixing, some of the skills you need for mixing, some of the purpose for why you do it, and all these different things around mixing so that when you get on the mixing board yourself, you can be thoughtful about it, you can be developing your skills, and in the end you can achieve a great audio mix that can be used to advance God's kingdom. So achieving a great mix requires a person to be thoughtful. Specifically, they need to think about the purpose of a good mix, how to approach mixing, what level to mix at, what skills they need to develop, what concepts apply to it, and then how mixing might change in different mixing environments. And I'm sure you've noticed by now that to achieve excellence requires both a technical know-how and a degree of artistic thoughtfulness. And I hope that's something you can really develop even on your own and on your own time at home as well. But now's the time to answer the questions below, and the upcoming hands-on session is going to be about preparing to mix and then mixing. We're going to use pre-recorded tracks of a band and do a fair bit of mixing guided by instructors. I think that's going to be really good for you. And then in session 7, we take a deep dive into EQ. God bless.